Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing the brainstorming session we began in the last episode with an unbaroned castle. So the goal today is kind of to fill out the second half of that story to get a good idea of what we think is going to happen, maybe flesh a little bit more out for these characters and some of the setting. I do want to say that I started the actual writing of it, so got the morning crew working on this one for us, which is good. I only got a couple pages in, so about up to the part where Clara is getting into the castle and is meeting the Baron. So just to kind of recap our plot that we created in the last episode, and then hopefully we'll be completing today. We've got a couple characters. Clara is our main character. She is a maid at this castle. There's also a Baron Randers who is in charge and who, unfortunately for him, has just bit the bullet. And then Mason is a messenger who is going to be an ally of Clara's kind of as the story develops. So plot-wise, Clara's starting off at the Hutch is the name that I gave sort of the servant's house in the writing process. So Clara starts at the Hutch, and then she is walking across the kind of village castle area to the castle. When she gets there, she needs to go to Baron Randers's living area and collect some clothes to wash. As she's doing so, she realizes that the Baron is dead. He has died. He's in there, but nobody realizes. So, kind of continuing our plot, Mason arrives with some letters. He was going to bring them to the Baron. She's sort of shocked, kind of wondering what in the world is going on. She takes the letters from him, ends up leaving after sort of just depositing the letters in the room. She's expecting the guards, somebody to, obviously figure out what happens and kind of take things from there. But when she comes back the next day, expecting to, have to kind of clean up after things or, just see what they want her to do that day, nobody does anything out of the ordinary. And it's sort of this weird moment where she goes back into the chambers, the Baron's chambers, and still there. Nobody's kind of wizened up to what's really going on. And we have this moment where it sort of dawns on her that she's able to make a decision here. Does she want to reveal what has happened to the guards? Say that the Baron has died, and allow them to kind of retake the castle and assume authority, or does she want to choose this dangerous game of feigning that the Baron is still alive and acting on his behalf to do good within the castle? It would be a very different story if she chose the former. For us, she's choosing the latter, and she's going to partake in this game of deception, trying to sort of one up or outsmart the guards, any sort of townsfolk that are opposed to any of the changes that she's trying to make, changes she thinks are for the better. Okay, so continuing our plot, as I said, she's kind of writing letters, signing envelopes, and reading confidential notes that should be delivered to the Baron, but she has, she's the middleman and is intercepting those. She's trying to enact good. As the days go on, the guards start to question what's happening, right? There's going to be a couple instances where maybe historically the Baron would have allowed the guards to, let's say, take some livestock from a farmer or do some sort of punishment for, let's say, a tax not being completely paid or some sort of violation of the Baron's law. In the past, the Baron would have acted pretty harshly, but all of a sudden, there's a bit of leniency. There's a bit of mercy coming from the Baron's way, and this is going to be, out of left field for those guards. They're not really going to understand why. So as the days go on, from the Baron dying and Clara starting to act on his behalf, those guards are going to get more and more suspicious. This is going to be a really interesting sort of ticking time bomb, plot-wise, that is going to drive Clara, convince her that she does need an ally or she needs some way to continue this ruse. And that ally is going to come in the form of Mason, who is the messenger boy, as I said. So on her walk, or on a walk from the castle, she's going to see Mason do an act of good. And as we kind of laid out in the first episode brainstorming this, that act of good is going to be very powerful because there's so few in this castle. It's a very dark place, sort of a survival type mentality people need to maintain. So for Mason to do this act of good, probably at his own cost to some degree to make it even more striking, hopefully, that's going to convince Clara, or at least help inspire her, or help her to trust a little bit that Mason isn't cut from the same cloth as everybody else. So as the guards get more and more suspicious, and she overhears some conversations of, in a day or two, if the Baron doesn't appear tomorrow, I'm just going to go in and take a look, see what's going on. She hears the guards having those conversations, and then that's the catalyst that makes her take that leap of faith and try to trust Mason. That's the moment where if she read him wrong, he's going to turn her in, and life is going to get very bad very quick. But fortunately for her, Mason is good-hearted, and they're going to form this alliance at Mason's own risk, where he comes in kind of at the last moment before those guards determine that the Baron has died, and sort of impersonates the Baron. Maybe puts on some old clothes and does a bit of a situation like in Knives Out, where the granny's looking through. Or actually, let me rewind a bit. Knives Out, spoiler if you haven't seen it. But after the grandpa dies, the nurse walks down the stairs with his nightcap on, and a few people, or the grandson or whatever, glances and sees her wearing his nightcap, doesn't realize it's her, thinks it's just Grandpa going down the stairs. Says Grandpa, get to bed, and then the story progresses. But we're going to have a kind of a similar moment where the guards just glance at Mason, who is going to be wearing the Baron's clothes in that scene, and they're convinced that the Baron's still alive. So that's one way we're going to prolong the ruse. And as I said in the first episode, if this was going to be a very short story, 2-3 pages, that would be a nice sort of climactic scene. We've got a lot of tension rising. We've got this moment of trust between Mason and Clara, and we've got kind of the satisfying resolution as they foil the guards. But this story deserves more space than 2 to 3 pages, I think. So that's, I think this is a really interesting story, and I think there's a lot more that we can investigate, a lot more we can uncover and tell. So our goal today is to uncover that second half of the story. So we're kind of picking up at the point where Mason has just started to impersonate the Baron. He's just allied with Clara, and we need to play this long game of how are they going to fulfill that second sort of goal, or the primary goal Clara had in the first place of impersonating the Baron, which was, how can we make this castle, this very dark, very kind of dangerous, mean-hearted place better? And I hope that's, that is going to be a difficult question to answer, but my hope is that as we kind of lay out some more plot here and try to think of some logical connections and building on what we already have, that we can find a satisfying answer, and that as I enlist the help of the morning crew, which is me, to write this out, that it's going to come to a satisfying story that is interesting. It's not going to be as lighthearted as the first story of this podcast, but lighthearted doesn't always equate to value. And I think this is still going to be a very interesting story, a more interesting story to me right now than the other one. So that's always good. Always want something that is entertaining to write and kind of makes you ask some questions. So let's ask some questions ourselves. We've got to flesh out the second half of that story. As I said, we're picking up with Mason impersonating Baron Randers. I want to do a little bit of that iterative plotting again, so I'm going to cast another line out, so to speak. And we know the end point of our story is some sort of conversion or improvement in the quality of life of the sort of entire castle area. So we need a kind of a build-up that's going to lead us towards a situation where not only the people would be more kind-hearted to each other and the situation for the people would be better, but somehow the guards participate in that as well. And I don't want to sort of spoil, well, I guess we are in this together. I'll spoil a little bit of what came to mind as I was writing that first part, with the sort of goal of being, I want the guards also to have this change of heart, because they are kind of the incarnations of the worst aspect of this castle. In the first couple pages I've written so far, I make them intentionally sort of bad and someone the reader should look down on as a cruel sort of, mean person. And then that transformation to a point where they can act with a little bit more kindness, and maybe, value things like duty and safety over things like power and, subjugation, things like that. That's going to be more movement than if the guards start out as sort of indifferent or even trending towards good. So, okay. So we need our final point to be an improvement in the quality of life. And then just to explain a little bit of what I wrote so far, came up with what I think is a really fun exchange as Clara is walking. Fun is not the right word. Very interesting, and I think a pretty powerful exchange as Clara is walking from the hutch, which is the servant's house, to the castle. It's raining. It's very miserable. I've tried to build up a little bit of sympathy for Clara and do a little bit of world building, and then we meet our first guard. And the setup, I don't want to actually read it. I'm going to save that for the next episode. But the setup is Clara is envisioning the warmth of the fires within the castle. She's seeing them far off, and she's kind of dreaming. She's hauling through this mud and is just looking forward to the moment she can get next to a fire. And she feels her basket wrenched out of her hands. She turns in time to see this little, this boy run away with it and kind of disappear into the side streets. And a guard comes to her right away. And my hope with this scene is that is to play on our expectations. So in 9 stories out of 10, when you get to this scene, something bad happens, a guard appears. We know that the guard is going to save the day, right? That's how it almost always works. When it doesn't, it's striking. So that's the case that I'm trying to capitalize on here. So this guard comes up to Clara. We expect the guard to maybe chase the boy down, get the basket back for her. Instead, it turns out that the boy is the guard's son, and he's very proud of the boy for having listened to his mother, who wanted a new basket, and the boy was smart enough to take one. So this is kind of the opposite perspective that we think the guard should have, right? Obviously, don't need to explain why that is material for a bad guard. And then I try to kind of further drive that point home by making this guard describe himself as one of the good ones, right? He's one of he considers himself to be a better guard morally than the others. So the fact that a good guard constitutes the father of a thief, a proud father of a thief, is, that's pretty bad grounds for your kind of lawmaking authorities. So that's one of the scenes that I've written so far, and like I said, I think it's pretty powerful. It kind of subverts the expectations a little bit, which is back to our kind of main plot point here. All the more reason the guards need to be changed over the second half of the story. So that's going to be a difficult question. I don't know what the answer is, but as we go, I think we can hopefully uncover something. So our 2 plot points here, and then we need to do some iterative plotting to get in between there, is Mason is becoming the Baron, and then we have that scenic end picture of a better quality of life for everybody. How do we get there? We know that Mason and Clara have to collaborate, that they're going to be working on letters together. One of the key reasons we chose Mason, the messenger, is that he does have an ear to the ground with other authority figures, right? He's carrying messages to them. He's potentially listening on conversations or meetings between people. So I think we certainly want to drive towards that somewhere. So I don't know where that's going to fall between those plot points, but I'm going to add a note that they use information Mason gathers from authorities. So this may be, we could invent some powerful families that Mason would be listening to. This could be the guards themselves, sort of speaking in the barracks, and Mason hears that. Could be a traveling, merchant or something like that kind of can stand in for a larger world. Say if it's a merchant from one of the capital cities, or a larger area within that kingdom, or a foreign kingdom, using information that this merchant designates for the Baron would be like a powerful perspective for Mason and Clara to levy. So at some point, certainly we're going to use information from Mason. I know that the guards are getting more and more suspicious. Do we want that suspicion to continue, or do we want the sighting of Mason impersonating the Baron to be sort of a blanket, correction for that suspicion, so that we get a few days of the soldiers just following orders and not questioning everything? I think this is a good question. My initial thought is I think a brief window to breathe is good for the story. We're really trying to build up that tension to the point where Mason has to ally with Clara. So to give them a little bit to get their feet under them, to maybe plan, I think lets the reader take a breath. It lets the story take a breath. The danger in that would be to lose momentum that we've worked really hard to accumulate in the scenes leading up to that. This is interesting because if this was a novel, I would certainly lean towards a breath, right? You can't sprint for 250 pages. So for that longer form, I think a breath, a long 20, 30 page sort of breath where they're getting their feet under them, all of that sort of thing, would be good. For this story, which I would anticipate is going to be 20 to 30 pages, plus maybe a 30% morning crew excitement factor, I don't know that we need a breath. There's value in just maintaining that momentum. Maybe let's see if we can come back to that. So what we have now, still our kind of principal plot point there is Mason with being the Baron, using his information to trick the soldiers in improving quality of life. What can we flesh out more? Well, I think for one, we can identify a few victims of the soldiers or of sort of the castle environment in general, and then how and identify the solution that Mason and Clara are going to use to fix it. We also need, and this is a larger question, of how the soldiers are converted. we need a situation that improves them, or rather improves their situation. That also is kind of the morally good angle that we're going for. And that's kind of a difficult balance to find within our fictional setting here. So what would be a good act that the soldiers would have to do that would also benefit them? An option would be kind of a I don't want to frame this in terms of kind of a mundane work situation, but to have them rub elbows with people that are embodying what values or what quality of life Clara is hoping to change the castle for. So what I mean by that is, and I think this has some potential, is let's say there's a nearby farming family or a smith. It doesn't really matter who the worker is, but a common person that is a laborer that needs something done, right? So let's say it's a farmer. We'll stick with that sort of trope. Farmer who can't supply a crop. So it's time for that farmer's crop to be supplied to the castle. That's essentially their tax. The farmer can't supply it. And in times past, this would be the time where that farmer is, come down heavily upon by the Baron, right? There would be nothing but punishment at this moment for having failed to supply the crop. Instead, the Baron's going to order the guards to help collect the last of the crop. So this is flipping the situation on its head, and I think that does two things, right? It actually helps the farmer, which is what is Clara's primary objective, but it also puts the soldiers in a position where they are no longer necessarily superior to the farmer. Maybe they know nothing about how to collect these crops. They don't know anything about transporting them. They know the two ends of a sword and how to use it. So when they need to essentially work for this farmer by the Baron's order, the soldiers are being put in an inferior position to the farmer to some degree. And they're in the space of the farmer enough that maybe some of that, I don't know if everydayness is the right term here, but some of that personality or personability might rub off on those soldiers. And then we can have a follow-up scene later on where those soldiers, our crop gathering soldiers, have a different perspective than just the typical mean-hearted, hierarchical soldiers that didn't interact with that farmer or that smith or however we want to fill that in. So we can start to create kind of gradients in the soldiers and try to move one of them to like a critical mass point where this group of soldiers is convinced enough that there's value in treating their inferiors with some kind of respect and maybe not maybe admiration, but maybe more just like some kind of trust that those people have skills and have strength of their own, and they're not simply there to be governed. If we can get enough soldiers to that mentality, I don't want this to manifest in a sort of civil war of those soldiers versus the other ones, but it will create kind of a conflict of perspective, where we're going to have one band of soldiers that say, things should be as they've always been. The Baron had it right. We're here to be in charge. We have the weapons. We know how to control. The other are going to say, as I said before, and I don't want to reiterate too much, but they're going to try to stand up for the common folk. So I think that's okay. This, like I said earlier, this is a difficult situation to pan out, because we are working with some complex kind of social factors. But I like that, at least for a plot point. I don't know if it's going to be the end-all be-all for this transition of those soldiers, but it'll be a step on that path, I think. So there's going to be a farmer who can't supply a crop. I'm adding to my notes here. Farmer who can't supply a crop. The Baron orders guards to collect the crop, and these soldiers have a powerful experience working for/with the farmer, and then their perspective is changed when they return to the castle. And I do like the idea, however we get there, of having kind of the two bands of soldiers, of guards, that get to represent, one being the old way, the old perspective of the Baron and of the guards, the other being this changing sort of output of Clara and Mason's efforts acting as the Baron. So we get to see the effect of their work as this secondary group of soldiers changes and becomes, kinder, valuing things like honesty, respect, those sorts of things. They get to be our proxy for how successful Clara and Mason are. And if this were a novel, we would probably not have them move in one direction. In other words, that secondary band of soldiers wouldn't get better and better and better. We could install some setbacks. But for us, I'm guessing that they're just going to be kind of continuously getting better. And we'll just use the contrast between them and the other band of soldiers as one of our tension points. There won't necessarily need to be an internal tension between that secondary group of soldiers as they're evolving and degenerating and evolving and that sort of thing. Okay. So we're getting closer. It's a journey of 1,000 steps begins with or journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step type situation, I think. Okay. So another thing we'll need is after Mason barges in, begins to impersonate the Baron, we need some kind of allying scene, if that's a word. We need a scene between Mason and Clara where they reinforce what Mason has done. They reinforce verbally what Mason has done with his action, which is they speak and they say that they're going to be allies, and they try to do some of this strategizing. So I think that logically would come after the impersonation. So let's say Mason and Clara meet after the day's work and discuss their alliance. And then we also need to do some of that strategizing. What's coming to mind is this is a point where not only do we need to to have them say, we're allies, we're going to work on this together, here's a strategy. In other words, I can listen to this person, or I'll deliver the letters to you, and then you read them and you sign them, and then I'll deliver them to where they need to go. But we need to tie that into kind of our next plot point. We need to make it more efficient. So to take that example of, I'll bring the letters in, you sign them, I'll deliver them to where they need to go. We need them to identify where that critical next step is. So what could that be? I don't want to keep doing examples with the guards too much, because I think we could get kind of fatigued, or our reader could get fatigued reading about, oh, the guards want to do this bad thing, Clara said no. The guards want to do this bad thing, Clara said no. So I want to find another power source, or maybe a source of injustice within kind of our story here, that Clara and Mason can flip. So, some options there. What would they be? Already in the story, they have changed rations. So soldiers were getting 3 rations, people were getting a half. People being the common folks were only getting a half. Clara and Mason changed that earlier, so we can't necessarily use that card again. We've got a mention later on with this farmer crop scene of kind of the taxes that the Baron in the castle would be levying on the people. So I don't want to do another tax, alleviation. So what could it be? Got to get creative. We could bring in a foreign party, and that wouldn't be bad. I actually like that. So let me rewind and think about specifically what we've done already. So we've improved the food situation. We've helped with taxes. A social improvement would be fitting. That's an area that we haven't done anything with yet. Unless if we choose a social improvement for one of the earlier ones, like in those first couple days, Claire's impersonating the Baron when the guards are getting suspicious. That could be a place where we insert a social enhancement. But for us now, I think let's just flesh out this scene for the post impersonation aspect of our plot. So that second half. So lots of options for what a social improvement could be. It could be maybe there's a typical way that common folk are treated from the soldiers, and then that gets changed. What I'm actually leaning towards to spice up the plot a little bit, and well, let's think about this. I was going to say we could bring in a foreign actor, so a trader, a merchant, someone like that. And since this castle is so historically mean, I think it'd be really fitting that they'd be equally mean to outsiders. Excuse me. If this Baron thrived on some core kind of leadership principles of power, cruelty, and maybe fear, we could even say, for his people. And it makes sense to me that if those are the means by which he's ruling, he wouldn't want somebody else, some other baron or powerful figure, to walk in and say, hey, I can lead the people as well, and I'll do it better. So what that would manifest as is anybody that visits the castle gets poorly treated, because the Baron doesn't want outsiders to stick around and to start to try to change things, whether that's a merchant or, a diplomatic party from another city or country or whatever. So all that, I guess, is to point us towards this social scene, which I think is going to be that a traveling merchant, arrives at the castle, and we can invent what would have been the common practice. Maybe that merchant would be kind of belittled by the guards. They wouldn't be given a good spot to stay, wouldn't be allowed to really sell their wares in the castle or to the any of the sort of noble families or well-to-do people. That merchant would just be kind of pushed towards the common folk. And we could flip that expectation, or not expectation, but that trend, by giving the merchant a good room in the castle, making the guards, through an order from the Baron, treat the merchant with respect, and that sort of thing. Is that a strong enough example? This is tricky. I think one of our difficulties here is we're trying to answer the very difficult question of how do we make these mean-hearted guards kinder and better people? And how do we do that in 3 or 4 snapshots of a scene? Right, there's not necessarily a solution to that. Otherwise, if there was, I think we should market it and get our retirement fund going. But we need to take our best stab at it. So we could have the merchant that is treated well be a social enhancement. I think let's stay with that for now and see if we can keep building out other aspects of this second half of the plot. What would be fitting? Let's discuss this for a second. Bookending stories is usually really satisfying, or maybe a more specific way of saying that is reflections within stories are usually very satisfying, where if something happens at the beginning and it's something we don't like, to do the opposite of that at the end is almost always going to be something we do like. So maybe the main character didn't get picked for the basketball team in chapter 1, and then over the course of the story, the character got better, made friends, and by the end was the first person picked. That's a satisfying change, and it's kind of proof of the change. So for us in this story, as I said, one of those first scenes is that guard being proud of his son for stealing a basket from Clara, a basket that's going to be given to his wife. So kind of a fitting flip side of that would be that same guard or a different guard kind of proxying for the initial one, doing kind of an opposite action. So to be very literal, the opposite action would be for Clara to get a basket back. I'm thinking that probably has to happen anyway for her to kind of fill her role as a maid, right? She's going to need a basket to carry clothes and sheets and all that sort of thing. And I don't know if I love the idea of being that literal, right? It's a little bit heavy-handed to use, I would say, the same image. But I think we do want that idea of something being given back to Clara that has been stolen from her by the castle or by this authority system. So if it's not going to be something as physical or as simple as the basket, it could be something else more abstract, like freedom, which was taken from her and now could be given back as kind of this new order is rolled out. So it could be freedom, could be some degree of power herself, where if it's revealed that her and Mason have been acting as the Baron and everybody comes to a point where they're happy with the changes that have been made, she and Mason could be given some kind of power, maybe not to continue acting as the Baron or continue acting with the authority of a Baron, but she may be moved out of kind of the merchant lifestyle and be given, a different role or a different opportunity. The answers for this plot are not coming as easily as other ones that have been simpler, and I think that's good. I'm trying to think of a quote, but I think I don't remember the exact quote, but there's value in kind of struggling against the blank page, and there's a handful of stories that will come very easily to a writer, and it just seems like this is a story that is very interesting to me. I think I know exactly what's going to happen. The language is coming, and that's great. That's really fun to enjoy those stories when they come. But I think it's like anything, like exercising, like learning a new skill. It's in that difficulty that more of the learning takes place. So we're a little bit closer to maybe kind of maxing out in the second half of the story and trying to handle some of these difficult questions than in our pre-battle trimmers, for example, where things were a little bit more laissez-faire and a little bit more flippant. Okay, so let's keep going. I'm going to reiterate what we have for the second half of the plot so far, just to resituate myself and get a little more of a footing. So Mason is going to impersonate the Baron. Mason and Clara meet after that day's work and discuss their alliance. We need a specific next step that they identify, not only to make that scene more efficient, but to give our reader some direction to there's a good sort of rule of thumb that a lot of authors go by. Brandon Sanderson discusses this a lot in his online lectures, which are excellent, and I would recommend. He discusses the idea of a promise and the eventual payoff. So that's kind of the reward system by which your reader is going to enjoy the story. So a promise would be, if in this scene with Mason and Clara, if we say, I hear tomorrow this merchant family has a big shipment coming in, and let me rewind. I heard from the guards that there's going to be a big shipment arriving tomorrow for this merchant family, and they're gonna lift, crates of fresh food and other valuables. And then the characters, Clara and Mason, decide we need to stop that somehow. That's a promise to your reader that there's this important event, and our story is going to move in a way towards that. And specifically, Mason and Clara need to stop that event from happening. So if they discuss it, we need to fulfill that promise by having them actually attempt to stop it. To simply say, there's going to be a shipment coming in tomorrow and the soldiers are going to try to lift it, we need to stop them, but not revisit that in a following scene, is very unsatisfying, right? It leaves a hole for the reader, and they're going to say, what happened there? I thought we were going to try to help. So we want to include that next step in that scene and build that promise that will have a satisfying payoff when we get there. So we have that scene. At some point after that, probably not the following scene, but later, we'll have that social improvement scene where a merchant comes into the castle, historically treated very badly, but is going to be treated better. And then beyond that, we're going to use information Mason gathers from authorities to help a farmer. And this is going to be where that second, I think actually I want to flip these around, because we need to get our soldiers to that second batch of soldiers that is kind of proxying for how successful Mason and Clara are. We need to get them changing earlier in the story. So after Mason and Clara discuss their alliance, next we're going to have that scene where there's a farmer who can't supply the crops, and the guards have to go out and help. So that's going to be next. And I think for us, let's go ahead and specify in that scene where our characters are discussing their alliance for the first time, that's where they're going to discuss the upcoming, tax, like tax breakdown or tax follow-up that the guards are going to have on the farmer. And for that to happen, it would need to make sense that earlier that day when Mason delivers the letters, there's mention in there of that farmer getting cracked down on for not supplying the crops. So I'm going to just add a quick note here to our previous plot point that we're going to mention in the letter that the farmer is getting cracked down on for lack of crops. And we could even specify a punishment in that letter if we want. Maybe who would this letter be coming from? There must be some kind of an accountant, or we can have a better term than that that's a little bit more medieval fitting. But the tax collector, the steward that's in charge of the figures. But somebody's going to be sending this letter to the Baron saying, hey, this family didn't meet their quota. You need to go straighten them out, or have your guards go straighten them out. So now Clara's primed with that information. Mason impersonates the Baron. Mason and Clara meet after their work that day, and then they discuss that they need to help that farmer. So now we've created that promise. We've primed our reader. The next scene, this is interesting actually. So we need to discuss viewpoint here, because the next scene would be the soldiers helping that farmer, which we can't show through either one of our characters, unless if they are with the farmer for whatever reason, which doesn't seem to make sense. So we need to make a decision here. Either we reevaluate our perspective, our viewpoint, and shift it to something like third-person omniscient, where we can follow the soldiers to the farmer's farm and show the scene through their perspective. Or we need to show the effect of their visit with the farmers through Clara, which would look something like the next day when she goes to the castle, she's in the Baron's chambers, doing the letters and that sort of thing. She hears these guards talking about their experience at the farmer's farm. So we would kind of see secondhand that scene through Clara. I like that for a couple reasons. One, it helps us just maintain a consistent perspective, and we get to stay with Clara. The other is it invites some suspense or some kind of mystery for that in-between period where we know the soldiers have gone out to the farmers. We don't know if they're going to follow the new the Baron's new orders of, essentially kindness versus cruelty. So as those soldiers are coming back, or as Claire is waiting to hear what happened, we don't know what happened. We're in the same shoes as Claire. We're hoping that these guards followed the new orders and that they helped the farmer, but we don't know. So I think, I like that a lot. So let's go ahead and add a bullet point. Clara overhears the guards' experience helping the farmer. She is relieved They followed her orders and not the old way. Excellent. Yeah, I like that a lot. So what would be really neat is if we could kind of do a bit of a butterfly effect. The butterfly effect being some action anywhere affects everything everywhere. Which for our story might look something like the guards help the farmer. The farmer is amazed that he wasn't, brought into the castle and thrown into the dungeon. He does another good act. So maybe he brings fresh, he brings his family into town and they bring some fresh pies or something, or they dig out some sort of fresh food like that, bring it back to the town, hand it out to maybe right back to the guards or maybe to somebody else. But we try to build this chain of good action that circles all the way back to the guards in some way, and we get that cycle going. And that's kind of difficult to do in a smaller scale story like this because we don't have the bandwidth to show, a 30 sequence chain, and that would kind of be difficult to do in an interesting way if it wasn't pretty carefully woven with our plot events. But we could shoot for 2 or 3, a triangle or a square of these kind of chain reactions. So what would that look like? So the farmer is going to be the next kind of actor here. I like the idea of them making some pies. Pies are always pretty welcome, I think. Farmer makes pies and gives to, who would the farmer be interacting with? It could be the miller. That would be kind of a logical person. Another one would be the guards, since the guards were the kind of source of, the farmer's happiness, since he wasn't thrown into the dungeon. But I want the chain to come around to the guards and not link directly back to the guards immediately. So let's say the miller, who would be responsible for kind of grinding the crop and, doing the weighing and measurement and that sort of thing. So the farmer is relieved. He can finally make his quota and gives pies to the miller. This is going to be a surprise for the miller because historically, millers and farmers, speaking kind of from a fictional perspective here, but oftentimes you have conflict between them, right? Because it's in the farmer's best interest, it's in the miller's best interest to kind of undervalue the farmer, so that the miller can make more of a profit on that later sale or that later transfer of the crop to someone like the castle. But the farmer wants to get paid fairly, which the miller wants to avoid. So there's this natural conflict of interest. So for the farmer to offer that olive branch, bring the miller some pies, the miller is going to be surprised at that. So then who would the miller interact with to carry on that goodwill? The castle would be logical if the miller is going to be selling flour or other crops to the castle. That does circumvent a little bit kind of our tax situation. If it were crops, right, I assume the crops would just be fed figuratively. The crops would be transferred directly to the castle. So I think let's keep this with flour, because the miller would need to be a sort of a middleman there in order to make the flour for the castle. So let's continue that chain that the miller is surprised, and what would he do for the castle to maintain that goodwill. I don't necessarily want to say give them a better price, not only because that doesn't seem entirely realistic, but that doesn't get us closer really to the guards. And we want to circle this back to the guards, where they can have that moment of realization of, I did something good for this person, and then it's come around the circle, or it's come around the horn back to me. So what would the miller do that would get us closer to the guards, and what would also be realistic? This takes a little bit of inferring, but let's assume that the miller is a lazy fellow. He works alongside or works for this pretty grungy, mean, pretty terrible castle. And probably to put it plainly, hard workers aren't valued. They don't get a gold sticker for working hard. So let's say the flour he makes normally sits around for a while. It's not high on his priority list to make great flour, or to transport it quickly, or maybe to keep it well. Keep it in a dry place, in a cool place. None of those things are probably priorities of his. So then the flour that the kitchens would be getting later on would be kind of subpar. Maybe some of it is moldy sometimes because it hasn't been kept well. It's not high quality, and that's going to equate to the food that's produced. So the bread isn't going to taste well, all of that sort of thing. And everybody likes good food. So I think, I like that a lot. Let's do it. So the miller's surprised by the farmer's pie. He improves his operation. So that's going to be keeping the flour, transporting, and also the quality of the flour. That's going to be directed to the kitchens. So the kitchens receive great flour, and they're going to be thrilled about that. And we could add a little because in here, because they've been not mistreated, they've been belittled. Let's say belittled. They've been belittled by the guards in the past for poor food. So we can have this sort of fear factor built in, that the cooks in the kitchen are afraid of serving bad food because they've been belittled or mistreated in the past because of it. And the reason I add that in is because it's going to enhance their excitement, their happiness at getting good flour, because they know, okay, now I have what I need to make really good food. And that's going to be not only better for the people eating it, but because of that, it's going to be better for me, because I'm not going to get the short end of the stick later on. Okay, and now we've completed the chain, so now the guards get to eat delicious food, and they're thrilled. We just need to tie this together and have an elegant, realistic way that the guards would know that their food is better because the miller provided better flour, because the farmer made him a pie, because the soldiers helped the farmer. So how do we communicate, or how do we tie those, tie that circle closed and let the guards realize why their food is all of a sudden better? We could act through Clara and Mason to tell the guards through a letter or an action from the Baron through Mason of, sort of castle-wide update that, or maybe a public thank towards the Baron of thank you for the great flower, we appreciate it. That seems a little out of character, so I don't think that's what we're gonna be driving towards. What we could, how about this? So the guards have great food. They eat it. It's amazing. It's better than they're used to. And they go down to the kitchens. And this will be kind of one of those, the proof is in the pudding moments where historically when the guards would kind of rush down to the kitchens after a meal, right? It's always for a bad reason. Something didn't taste good. It was cold. They didn't like it. So when the cooks see the guards coming, they're going to have that gut reaction. Oh no, I thought the flour was better. Did I mess it up? What's going on? But we're going to have this like joyful, even not joyful. We're going to have this like semi-grateful moment or a surprised moment where the guards ask the cooks, what did they do differently? Why is this so much better? And cooks are going to be thrilled. They're going to, say, the miller just gave us great flour. We just did our thing. But it was the miller who really, really helped. And then we could rewind. We could rewind the soldiers to the miller, and have them ask what changed. Are you getting bribed were you bribed by a cook to make better flour? What's going on? We can try and reinforce kind of what the guards would expect to be the reason for the miller's improved work ethic and foil that with the good intention that the miller had from the farmer. And then the miller would tie the soldiers back to the farm, the miller would help the soldiers realize the chain of goodwill by saying the farmer made pies for me and kind of reconciled with me after a couple of years of kind of this grudge against each other. We run into the same issue with that regression of the soldiers through that chain of we can't do that without third person omniscient. We can't be in those scenes unless we could be in the kitchen scene if Clara is in the kitchens working on something. So she could be there, or she could be at the dinner when the guards are eating. I think so. At the dinner when they're eating and they say, "This is great. We need to go thank the cooks." I think either one of those is realistic. We won't be able to get to the scene where the soldiers get to the miller, and maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need it. Maybe we just need to show that first step of the soldiers understanding, and then we can show their perspective coming out of they understand that that the 1, 2, 3, 4 circled back to 1. Okay, so I like that. I think that's pretty good, and that's a good movement for us in kind of distinguishing one group of soldiers from the other, and having them. we could even do this. So all the soldiers eat the dinner, all the soldiers enjoy the food, all the soldiers go down to the kitchens, but only the soldiers that worked with the farmer initially and truly understand that they're helping the farmer, help the miller, help the cooks, help them. Only that secondary group of soldiers changes. The other soldiers could actually have an opposite reaction where they hear that the miller changed something, or the miller's working harder, and they just say great, or they assume it's a bribery or he was threatened or whatever, but they have the opposite perspective of the sequence of events and the reasons for that, of the second group of soldiers. So I like that, and that sets us up to have that two sets of soldiers kind of develop. So we need a couple more scenes then to let that development pan out a little bit. So we had shifted our social development one to be after this farmer scene. So let's go ahead and add that in. So our social development was going to be a merchant coming to town. Do we want to stick with that example? Or do we want to try and keep this story entirely internal without any influences from other cities, other countries? I do think I like a traveling something. It could be a traveling traveling merchant, traveling troupe. If we want to bring in like a larger cast of characters to kind of have a different perspective. So these would be like actors and musicians coming in. One nice thing about that is that, these actors and musicians really go a long way towards embodying kind of excitement, happiness, leisure, things like that, which are what we're kind of driving towards. So to have them around highlights that theme a little bit more. And I think it also I think it also provides an opportunity kind of for our end note of the story when we get to that, that last bullet point of improvement in quality of life. An easy way to demonstrate that would be if we have a traveling musician group around, to allow everybody to kind of watch a play or to enjoy a song together in the castle courtyard or something like that. That's a nice picture of some kind of equality, some mutual communal enjoyment of something. Nobody's being forced to work while another group of people get to listen to the fun stuff. Everybody gets to participate. So I think I like that better than just the general improvement in quality of life bullet point. That gives us a definitive scene to drive towards, and a pretty good one, I think. One that does fulfill our kind of our thematic goal, which is better than a question mark. It's always easier to revise something than nothing. That's something a lot of writers and a lot of folks say, and certainly true. So let's go ahead and update that last bullet point to kind of a scenic end note of everyone watching a play / song from the traveling troupe. So that's nice. I like that a lot. How long would that troupe realistically stay in a town or in a castle? Because if they're going to be there at the end of the story, we need to be careful not to bring them in too early. They may stay a week. Is that enough time for the second half of our story to play out? I think so, probably. So, okay. So it doesn't worry me that the troupe is going to be there, 3 or 4 or 5 days before the end of the story. That's not too long for them to be there. It's not too long for them to be there. It does potentially shorten our window for kind of changing the atmosphere of the castle. Can we kind of change the guards enough in 3 or 4 days? That's kind of tricky. By the other side of the coin, I don't really want to stretch this out over 20 days. 20 big scenes of Clara and Mason circumventing or leading the guards towards this change. Not necessarily because I don't want to write that volume, but because I think we're going to get fatigued. The reader is going to get fatigued reading 20 of those scenes. We need some real variance in sort of the plot devices we're using to change these characters. So the bottom line there is that 3 to 4 days for the troop to be around is fine. We need to flesh out that social development scene a little bit of the troop comes in, they're expected to be treated one way. Clara and Mason make them be treated a different way. So we can't make the historic treatment too hard, otherwise these musicians would never have come here in the first place. If they would just get turned out on their ear every time, they'd say, let's cross this one off the map and never come back to this castle. So let's say historically, the musicians have only been able to play in the castle. For the noble families, soldiers, and Baron. The common people have not been included. So that's exclusion. We also need, or I think I want, some actual act of kind of hostility between the guards and the musicians. So not only are the musicians not allowed to play for the common people, who they probably really want to play for in actuality, but there's some type of friction between the musicians and the castle in general. So that could take the form of the musicians not being paid a fair amount, so them being underpaid, underfed, underhoused, something like that. It could be that they are held longer than they want to be. So maybe in times past, they plan to be there for a couple days and then move on to a better city. But the Baron has said, you need to stay here for 3 weeks, and we're not going to let you go, and we want to be entertained for 3 weeks. Again, that might be too strong of a reason that would disincentivize the musicians from coming here now. So I think I'm more inclined to just kind of a general poor treatment of them. Underfed, underpaid, housed. So let's add that. Historically, the common people have not been included. The musicians have been underfed, underhoused, and underpaid. So we might want to give them a little bit of a reason to come here in the first place, which I think we can make a semi-convenient one. I mean, it's not really the crux of the story. So the only reason they came here is it's on the way, or let's say it's the only midpoint between two big cities that they want to see. So I think that's pretty believable. I mean, within our medieval setting, it's unlikely that there's going to be 1,000 little towns scattered around that they could stop at. So between the two big cities that they do want to see, this is a convenient midpoint for them to stop at and kind of recover, get their travel rations built back up, get some rest, be off the road. So I think that's fine. That's enough of an incentive for them to stop here, even though they are expecting to be underfed, underhoused, underpaid. So now Clara and Mason need to change that. And this is actually, the more I'm thinking about this, the more I like the musicians as our kind of social development piece, because Clara and Mason really have an incentive to make the musicians happy and to get on the right page, get on the right foot with them. Because Clara and Mason are going to recognize these musicians have the ability through music and through story to brighten people up, to change people. Like they have the ability to do what Clara and Mason want done. So it's in their interest as well as the people's interest to treat these musicians well. And again, I'm just writing a note down here. They're treating the musicians well because they recognize the transformative value the musicians can bring. Okay, so that's good. The soldiers are going to want to treat the musicians one way. They're going to need to maybe give up some of their housing area or some of their rations or something like that to make room for the musicians. I think we need at least one more. I mean, I don't want this to feel too thin in terms of, do we have enough touch points for these guards to change their perspective? Just to recap, the first real one, I mean, we have allusions to a couple changes that Clara and Mason make, or specifically Clara makes in those first couple days while the guards are growing suspicious. But we don't get into it too much. In terms of specifics that the guards interact with in that second half of the story, they're working with the farmer. They see that chain of goodwill that circles back to them through the cooks. And then there's this social development piece with the traveling musicians. What would be the next step? What's the next sequence of change that we can drive towards? Is there any way we can bundle some of these together? So we've already got social, we've got kind of a political power of that tax evasion or tax shortcoming situation. Okay, so social, taxes, some type of power, like physical power, would be another variable we can play with. So, what does that mean? I don't want to add a dark component to that, or a very dark component to this, which would be something like, maybe somebody was supposed to be hanged or thrown into the dungeon. We could talk about the dungeon, but maybe somebody was going to be hanged, and Mason and Clara changed that so that person's no longer going to be hanged. I think the dungeon has some potential. So how could we play with that? I mean, that's right. That's the stereotypical, bad thing a castle does is it throws somebody in the dungeon, and it's very poor living conditions in there, terrible food, very bad. So how could we play with that stereotype in a way that would show these soldiers kind of the error of that old way? One option, and I kind of need to understand this as I'm saying it to see if I like it, but one option would be some situation where a soldier actually ends up in the dungeon. Maybe it's some kind of a mistake where that soldier's thrown in and locked up, or the soldier does something wrong that is so wrong, he deserves to be in the dungeon. He has a realization in there of how bad it is. Then when he comes out, he is the voice of reason, or that voice of change that says it's really bad in there. We need a different way. I like some of that, but I think it's going to be hard to squeeze that into a scene or two. I think it'd be hard to communicate through Clara and Mason. So what alternatives would we have to demonstrate a power struggle or a rebalancing of some power structures, maybe especially physical, just because that is different from kind of the other changes or examples we've used so far? We could invent some kind of a pastime for these soldiers. Let's say they do like a sword fighting tournament and they do betting on it. They bet on each other, and as it sounds, they make money in there. It's a violent pastime that serves themselves, re-emphasizes kind of the brutal nature of the old way, and right, the outputs are like excitement at the violent fighting and also money. So we have two kind of corrupting influences there. So if we invented that as a pastime, we could abolish it. Seems to... Ooh, okay. Okay, here we go. So rather than abolishing it, right, that's like using a hammer in place of a needle. That's very blunt. Instead of just telling the guards to stop doing it through Clara, we could actually transform that activity, that pastime, from this gambling, violent sword fighting, intra-guard sword fighting, to they've been designated to train the next wave of guards or soldiers or whoever, meaning like the younger kids from the common folk. The guards have been designated from the Baron, quote unquote, to train these kids well and to treat them well in doing so, so that the kids can be future guards. I think that's a digestible solution. And what that does for us is it gives the guards a reason, right? The guards are believing that, so at this point, some of them are starting to change their perspective. Others aren't, but it gives all the guards a chance. Let me step back a second. I'm trying to take this from a couple angles. It's acceptable to the guards because they see this as they're being given more power. They're going to be frustrated they can't do their sword fighting anymore, but they should be pleased that they have more power to train these kids. And they're seeing this as a as like placing a high value on the role of guards and investing in the future. So by the Baron saying, I think it's important that these kids are trained for future guards. Secondarily, the Baron, quote unquote, is saying, I value you now. So if I value the future you, these kids, I value you now. So this act, or this order from Clara, pats the soldiers on the back. It gives them some power, which are the two of the reasons it should be digestible for him. We could play with some conflict between our two sets of soldiers if we want, but let's say right now they just kind of accept that. And then from our change perspective, obviously what we're doing is we're, again, like the farmers, we're putting the soldiers in an environment with people that will change them for the better, these kids, right? A common denominator of parents is, I think they by and large, they say their kids make them better. They enjoy, it's like the Michael Scott or the classic teacher line, fill in the blank, but it's that saying of, I learned more from you than you did from me, which I think is true a lot of the time. And we're going to put our soldiers in that situation where they can learn some of that kindness and some of that curiosity and respect from the kids, and start to value that a little bit. So let's get this down in a couple notes. So when Morning Crew me tries to think back to this plot point, I don't scratch my head too badly. So we need a physical sort of development where the soldiers' pastime of gambling and sword fighting is replaced by a training session with the town kids. Okay. The guards are excited, or the guards understand, let's say appreciate. The guards appreciate the power being given to them and the value from the Baron. Okay. So that's not too bad. Now we've kind of hit that development piece 3 times in the second half of the story. A little bit different angle each time. I want our proxy soldiers, so that second group of soldiers that initially was with the farmers and has been changing. I want more of a head-off or a confrontation at some point between them and the other set of soldiers. I also want to bring Clara and Mason more to the forefront, because I'm noticing a lot of these scenes are the effect of their, these letters and the things that they're doing. So how could we bring more into these scenes? So for this physical development one specifically, we have musicians around. Let's see, can we incorporate them at all into, or maybe we just reorder this a little bit. I think that's good, actually. Let's shift this scene with the kids to before the musicians come. So now it'll be farmer, soldiers training the kids to fight, and then the musicians coming in. I think I like that. It gets our musicians closer to the end, so we don't have to answer the question as much of them being there for an extended period. It also keeps our cast smaller, which for more of the story, which I like. Okay, so let's circle back to our physical development scene where the soldiers are working with the kids. I want to bring Clara and Mason into it. This would be a nice scene for them to watch some of that development occurring. This could also be a scene where they do some strategizing again, right? We need to show them working together more so that the payoff of their work is more exciting and more rewarding. So I'm going to add a sub point beneath our physical development scene. So let's just add the mini point of Clara and Mason strategize. But more importantly, we need to get them there, and we need to get them there in a believable way. I think what I'd like to do here, and this feeds into the soldiers being given more power, or assuming that they're being given more power, is that we make this training session entertainment for the town. We make it a spectacle. Yeah, I like this a lot, actually. So make the training session like a spectacle. Spectacle is maybe not the correct word, but entertainment, or an event. How about that? An event. So what we're doing there is the soldiers know they're getting more eyes, right? More people are watching them. More people are seeing them as authority figures as they train these, farmhands. So the soldiers are going to like that they, they're being given more power. What we're really doing here, we're trying to be sneaky, is that we're bringing everybody together. This is an opportunity for the town at large to congregate and to participate in something, even if it's not necessarily the, musical, joyful celebration that we're going to try to end the story with. But it is a communal type activity. We can have, some street vendors selling food or stuff like if the guards are all out there training, they might need food from the kitchens brought out, food from the castle brought out. And, maybe if they're too busy doing their training, there's some leftovers that can be distributed out through the town to some degree. The short of it is, this is a great opportunity to bring our whole town together, start to build a sense of community, and erode some of that animosity between the guards and the townsfolk. So if the guards have always been very mean, now they're maybe not necessarily being kind, but their attention is directed at something else, even if that something is, they think, like their own power. Even if the guards think that they're just demonstrating their own power, they're really doing a service for those kids that they're training. And they are, by virtue of ignoring the other townsfolk, they're being kind to them. So I think that's really good. And we're building out more of this story. I think this is certainly going to be one where in the telling, some aspects are going to grow. Some may shrink a little bit. That certainly happened. The very first bullet point of our plot is Clara is walking from the servant's house to the castle, through the castle, and discovers Baron Randers has died. I've only written the first clause of that sentence, which is Clara's walking from the servant's house to the castle. And the story's, 900 words or so. And there's some nice details in there, like that exchange with the guard, and then some kind of intro stuff from the servant's house that I really like. So, 900 words of a story for 11 words of plot outline. That's a pretty high ratio. That's not going to continue. But the point is, our outline can carry more story than maybe we think, right? It can. There's a lot of story hidden behind these outline points. Okay, so I think we need that confrontation that we've mentioned a couple times. So now we've got, 3 really good developmental points for these soldiers, orchestrated by Clara and Mason. The last being the musicians coming to town and putting on some kind of a entertainment. We could actually scaffold this really nicely and say, since the soldiers are training those kids still, that rather than the entertainment being just in the castle, it's now able to be played out in the courtyard area where they're training, or, more in the town where maybe the townsfolk can't fully participate and listen and, huddle around the music, but they can hear it. And it's that immediacy, or not immediacy, but it's that sort of movement of the music from only being in the castle to being in the castle courtyard, and then finally at the end of the story to be at, the heart of the town. So I like that. Let's say musicians perform in the courtyard. Well, here's a minor inconsistency. If they're performing in the courtyard, that would be because the soldiers are training the kids in the courtyard. And if they had done that the previous scene, when everybody was watching and sort of being communal, why wouldn't everybody be there when the musicians are there? So I think that's a little bit of an inconsistency that we don't want want to make it through to the final version. We want to sand that out and kind of polish it up. So I do really like the idea of the music progressing, though, from castle, courtyard, town. Can we change it, though? Can we redirect anything here? How about this? We let the townsfolk come into the courtyard for the training and for the musicians. So the musicians are performing in the courtyard, and all the, let's say, available townsfolk listen. So the townsfolk can listen to the music, but because the soldiers are training, they don't have the attention to watch a play from this traveling troupe, which we can kind of identify as the highest form of, enjoyment. So even more than music, these people would like to watch a play. And then that will allow us to, in that final scene, use, rather than everybody listening to music, it can be everybody listening to, or everybody watching a play. And, there's no training, there's no work going on. It's leisure, it's enjoyment, it's communal. So I think that's how we can differentiate those two scenes with the musicians, and we can also allow the townsfolk to be in the courtyard. Okay, so that's done. Let's carry on. Do a bit of iterative work here. Certainly, I'm guessing there's only 2 or 3 more scenes to identify here. One of them has to be some kind of confrontation between our bands of soldiers. And it would be more satisfying if Clara and Mason get to participate in that somehow, or if it feels as though their orders or actions influencing the soldiers are really effective, meaning that, whatever actions they take, even if they're not in the conflict themselves, if it feels like their actions made the one group of soldiers act as they did, then that's just as good. So that's a resolution point that we need to get, is to resolve that tension between the two bands of soldiers, so that we can have a a united sort of town and castle at the end of the story. So I think we need another point of conflict after or during these points, or these developmental changes, right? So the soldiers are changing by degrees through these three series of events, and we can bring the distinction between those two groups we need to bring to the forefront, and we need to inflame that somehow so that they have a conflict. So how could we do that? I think a good option is, right, we've been working through Clara and Mason, through these letters from the Baron, through misdirection. I mean, it would be great to add a little bit more explanation of how we're getting these soldiers to do these things. I don't want to string this episode out too long. That may be something I kind of fill in the writing. But the plot point here, I think, is that our group of soldiers that are aligned with the old way of kind of power and authority, they're still suspicious of the Baron's activities, or lack of visibility and that sort of thing. That I want an order to come from Clara and Mason to do something good, and these soldiers to put their foot down. I think, where they say, I don't know what's happened. The Baron's changed. I'm not with it anymore. And how does that manifest? Does that become violent between the two groups of soldiers? Does the old cast of soldiers leave. This is tricky. This is a point where we need to be very creative, because the sort of realistic, obvious solution of these soldiers are mean-spirited, they're bloodthirsty, maybe not bloodthirsty, but they're not against violence. They would probably just turn, or like they would use the sledgehammer approach, and they might just barge in to the Baron's room to like question him and see what's going on. Or they may fight the other guards outright and say, I'm not doing this anymore. I think it would make more sense for them to barge into the Baron's area. Where I was going with that before I kind of changed my line of thought was, a realistic action for them would be to confront the other soldiers physically, and we'd have some kind of a fight. One group would win, and essentially the fate of the castle would be decided from there. Thematically, that's really not what I want. I don't want, our good soldiers to win through killing the bad soldiers off. That's not satisfying. That doesn't feel like we earned anything by moving them to a more of a place of kindness or something like that. So my point was going to be, though that may be a semi-realistic response, it really doesn't work for our story. Unless if we were to change other things. It's really not the satisfying progression that we want, so we need to be creative and find something else. As I was saying that, I want to explore the idea of these soldiers putting their foot down, the soldiers of the old way, putting their foot down and confronting the Baron. So if they were to do that, they're either going to see, if he's still in there, they're going to see that he has died, or if we sort of move or hide the Baron somehow with Clara and Mason, they're going to be confused. I don't feel like confusion gets us anywhere. I think it's an inactive plot sort of progression. Like it doesn't move those soldiers in a way that I see productively. I think if they see the Baron has died, that like only action will come from that, right? So how would they react? If my first reaction is that they see the Baron has died, one of them wants to assume control. One of them says, it's my time to shine. I'm the new Baron. Listen to me. I don't know what baloney has been going on the last couple days with all this nice stuff. I'm changing things. Everybody listen to me. They could have an internal conflict as different, as they all vie for that seat. And that could be a convenient way for them to kind of take themselves out, physically. Again, I don't know if I want that resolution. I don't know if I want like a self-imposed violent resolution to clear the way for our good soldiers to do their thing. Because the challenge here is we want to convince those hard-hearted, mean soldiers to change. And not because they got killed off by their fellow guard, but because they want to. So what would be a different reaction reaction to seeing the Baron is dead, that would still be realistic, that we can use for our story? These guards could have been tied to the Baron in some way. So not just that they've been hired to work there, but maybe the Baron, now this is interesting, maybe the Baron had mistreated them in the past. Had they were sons of farmers or townsfolk or whoever who didn't pay a tax, and instead of being merciful, the Baron said, "Great, I'll take you don't have enough crop. I'll take that kid." And they takes him, puts him into kind of the training regime for these guards, and then these soldiers feel as though a large part of their life has been taken away because of the Baron. They they're very bitter about it, but they recognize the power of power. They recognize maybe what they see as the value of it, and they want that because they know the effect it can have. So that might be a little bit of a rationale for why these soldiers specifically are aligned more towards being mean or cruel or power seeking. But when they see that the Baron has died, I could see a way we can play it as sort of this breaking of the chains, that they feel as though they've been tied to the Baron and the structure of the castle because they were taken into it, and they recognize its power. But that chain has been lifted. We could say there's this moment of freedom, and try to use the perspective of the other soldiers to convince them now's the time we do this differently. We don't need to take kids from families anymore. If someone doesn't pay their taxes, there's a new way. We don't need to rule through the fear and the the means that the Baron did, controlling people. Now's the time we can change, and the next kid doesn't need to have your experience. This is I think the human inclination that we all want something better for our kids, if we have kids, or for the next person than what we had. And I think we can tap into that with these soldiers. And to make that more satisfying, it'd be great if Clara or Mason could be that voice of kind of consolation and change. And then that secondary group of soldiers that does believe things should be done differently, they would be more of kind of a supporting aura, or supporting whatever in the background that reinforces to the group of soldiers that have were the old way, that we think this is a good change, let's do it. Okay, so for brevity's sake, I don't want to get into like the specifics of that conversation too much, but let's say that the guards, old way guards, just to distinguish them, the old way guards are fed up with the changes and want to know what's going on. They barge into the Baron's room and see that he's dead. Part of me is tempted to spark a little bit of a conflict of one of them says, "Hey, I'm the Baron now, listen to me," and then they kind of rise up against that one. I think the reason that is sounding like an option is that it's a definitive step from those soldiers that they don't want a new Baron, right? Even if, so this would be before kind of Clara tries talking them into, hey, this is the time for change, we can do something different. If the soldiers, knock out or throw into the dungeon or whatever this other guy that rises up and says he wants to be the new Baron, it's proof of what they really want, even if they haven't recognized it themselves. The fact that they don't want someone new stepping into that role means that they want something different. And then Clara can use that as evidence with her cleverness, right? She's a very clever character. She can use that as the nail in the coffin to convince these guards that they really do want something different, and they can get on board with this new thing. So yeah, so I like that a lot. Originally I was a little hesitant of that because I didn't want them to kill somebody. But we can temper that a little bit and have them knock the soldier out or throw him in the dungeon or whatever. Okay, so they barge into the Baron's room and see that he's dead. Let's build out this plot a little bit more. One of them, let me finish the sentence here. One of them rises up and claims to be the new Baron. They throw him in the dungeon. Do we want to get the dungeon involved again here? Isn't our whole thing that we're supposed to do things better? Catch-22. How about they throw him in the dungeon with a sucker? Make it a little bit better for him. Okay, let's come back to that in a second. The earlier thing I was going to say was mystery. You barge into the Baron's room and see that he's dead. One of them... Oh, yeah, okay, yes. So, I was going to say, the one that rises up would be very satisfying if it was one that had done, one that was particular early on. One that had done something that to kind of alienate him from the audience, from the reader, to stand out as this person specifically was really allied with the Baron, really enjoyed being superior to other people, didn't mind being cruel, that sort of thing. For the reason being that that person really embodies what we've been calling the old way here. So for them to be the one that gets thrown into the dungeon or gets denied this new Baron chair is satisfying. And that's the same reflection idea we had earlier with the soldier that's son steals Clara's basket for Clara to receive something at the end, which, as we identified, is going to be kind of the freedom to leisure, to enjoy this music, signifying kind of that this power dynamic of the worker and the lounger is gone, and everybody is on more equal footing. That's kind of what she's receiving here at the end. So, okay. So, as I'm writing, in this, like I have mentioned a couple times, that the story grows in the telling. As I'm writing, I think there's going to be some natural opportunities to bring a guard in particular to the forefront. Maybe it's the guard that I already included with the thieving son. But we'll bring a guard to the forefront to embody some of these kind of bad traits, and then he will be the guard that gets thrown in the dungeon. Again, I don't love that as one of our finishing flavors of the story, since we're kind of, it's satisfying in terms of we are throwing out the old way. It's a pretty... I don't know if I want to say it's thematically fitting because it does run counter to being kind to people, providing more opportunity, that sort of thing. But it's fitting that we're denying and we're shutting down the old way, sort of as the final nail in the coffin again. So I'll think on that. I'm going to leave that note in the in the outline here, and then by the time I get to it, by the time the morning crew catches up to us in our plotting, I may massage that into a little bit of a different form. But needless to say, that soldier that tries to claim it tries to make a claim to be the new Baron will not get that reward. So, I mean, I think that's it for our plot. After those, that first band of guards kind of, throws him out in the dungeon, Clara's going to convince the guards that they do want. Man, I need a new keyboard. That they do want change. We can try to kind of resolve that, and then I think it'd be. So sort of the last thing would be what will be the power structure going forward? Can we? I think it's far-fetched that the guards would say, okay, why don't you just take over command of everything? You've been doing it for the last week. Things have been going pretty well. Let's put you in charge of everything. That seems very far-fetched. I don't think that would happen. Do we need a new power structure put in place? I don't know. I don't think we need it. There's probably a way to do it and make it satisfying, but we can kind of take the chicken's way out here, which happens more often in stories than I thought certainly. But if you have an eye for it, it's easy to kind of identify. A good example is, what's the story called? The Lady and the Tiger, maybe. It's sort of an older kind of classical short story that may have touched bases with you in English class. But the gist is there's a gladiator type figure. He is in love with the king's daughter, the princess, and so I'm paraphrasing from my 7th grade education here. But this is the strokes of it. He loves the princess. They determine that they're gonna ally in the upcoming kind of gladiator fight, and she's gonna point him towards one of the 2 doors. One of them has a tiger behind it, so the kind of embodiment of his death. He's gonna die. The other is a door leading out, and it's a metaphor for freedom. She's going to point him towards freedom, supposedly, right? Because he thinks she loves him. He loves her. He thinks that she has his best interests at heart. The story builds up to this scene where, he's in the sort of the ring. There's the 2 doors. The king says he needs to choose a door. The princess indicates which one he should take. He opens the door, and the story ends. We don't know what the answer is. We don't know what was behind the door. Same thing happens at the end of A Quiet Place, more or less. Right? The movie, and spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. Very interesting premise of there's these alien monster creatures that have excellent hearing. You need to be very quiet so that they can't catch you. At the very end, or the end of the story, there's some conflict. Shotguns fired, and let me back up a step. The characters identify a new way to fight these aliens, which seems to be really promising. In doing so, they shoot one with a shotgun. Shotguns are very loud. Their house is swarmed by these aliens, right? And the whole point of the story has been to be as quiet as possible. We see a couple of these creatures the whole time. And then the final shot of the movie, after the shotgun goes off, is an aerial shot looking down at the house, and it's just being swarmed by these creatures. And it's the same question as The Lady and the Tiger. We know the characters have this new technology or this new strategy that may defend them from the creatures. We also know the creatures are super deadly. We don't know what happens in the 5 seconds after that scene cuts off, right? Either they're going to be able to combat these creatures, or they're going to be lunch. So those are two examples. Again, this is pretty common. Those are striking examples, but this happens in dialogue super commonly. Yeah, you can leave the dialogue on a buzzer beater and, say something really funny, and then whatever the character would follow up with isn't going to be as sweet as the punchline of that joke. So what you see a lot, especially in TV shows, is a scene builds up. There's an exchange between characters. One, delivers the punchline that's really funny, or it's a head scratcher of a line that, it is funny in itself, and then it changes scene. So can come up with lots of examples of that, but that's our principle at play. And I think now is a fine time to use it. So just to circle back to our story and how that's going to filter in. Clara is convincing the guards that they do want change. The last sort of logistical question I have is, how do we get a power structure in play that's going to communicate that this goodwill that the guards, Clara, and the town are sort of feeling is going to continue into the future? We can take the chicken's way out here and sort of do the end on a high note approach by finishing the story with that scene of everybody gathered around watching the play, eating food from the kitchen, and end it there. We don't need to get into the nuts and bolts of, okay, they're gonna implement a sort of democratic communal system of elders, 2 of the guards, couple townsfolk. We don't need to water down this high point of the story with logistics. Let's end on a high note and use the metaphor of everybody being together in that last scene to communicate that they're going to find a way forward that is satisfying and is good for everybody. I think that's what we want. So that's it. We laid out the second half of the story. Just for my entertainment, I want to take a word count here and see. We came up with 300 words of notes. Our outline is 300 words in about 2 hours. So, as always, very productive. So I'm very happy with that. I'm really excited to write this story. Just to give you an idea of the next steps, I'm going to enlist the morning crew to crank this one out. And then for our next episode, I want to do a couple things. I'll read through the story, and then I want to revisit it, revisit the prose, not necessarily the plot structure we have here, but the prose. And I want to explain maybe why I phrased things as I did, or what sort of themes I was trying to highlight by the dialogue or the choice of imagery. So I want to walk through the prose and really try to break it down and let you know what I was thinking as I was writing. I didn't really do this for pre-battle trimmers for the reason that we were writing it as we were going. On air, live, which is a different format. You get a little bit, or hopefully a lot of it, of my thoughts as I was writing that. But I think this next episode, where I share the completed story that has taken some time and has been polished and is a good quality story, hopefully, assuming things go well, I think that's going to be a really interesting episode, and it's going to be more compact and more value packed than maybe going through a story, especially of this length, live. So thanks so much for listening through the second half of the plot. I'm really excited to get this down on paper, and I'll see you on the next page.